Welcome to Simple Conversation with ASG.
Follow your new favorite podcast host with a link in the description.
So tell me, who is Richard Cacioppe?
Well, I am a graduate of West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. I graduated in 1962 and served for 6 years on active duty in the Army. Was in Vietnam twice, and then got out and worked for IBM for a number of years before I went to a series of other businesses. But in the course of my business career, I lived in South Bend, Indiana, which is the home of Notre Dame University, and I lived about 4 miles from the university, and so I got a good feel for the culture and the history and traditions of Notre Dame, and I'd already absorbed those same things from the military academy, so it was natural for me to gravitate to a story that encompassed both institutions.
Amazing. It's going to be a real history lesson here for me and the audience, hopefully. So, first thing I have to ask you is, why West Point? What drew you to it?
Well, I grew up in New Jersey, which is about 3 hours, maybe 100 miles south of the military academy. And when I was a Boy Scout at age 14, my Boy Scout troop took a trip to West Point. And when I stepped off the bus, I was just overwhelmed by the tradition of the place and the significance of it. And I had read, I'm a big student of military history. I had read a number of stories, and I understood the history of West Point, and I was just overwhelmed by it. And so from the time I was 14 until I got into West Point when I was 19, I devoted my life to understanding what it would take to get into West Point and understanding and memorizing all of the things you had to do. And I was fortunate. I didn't get in right out of my high school after high school graduation, but I joined the National Guard, and through the National Guard, I was able to get an appointment in the year after I graduated from high school. But it was that initial visit to West Point which just overwhelmed me and convinced me that that was the place that I wanted to go.
There's always a stereotype or like an unwritten rule, basically, that those academies, especially military and army academies, they're just so tough, and they really, as they are, sink or swim kind of. Did you feel that when you were in West Point? Was it just really mentally tough you needed to be?
Well, it was really tough because West Point, back when I went, was was the premier place that produced, and still is, to produce Army officers for the United States Army. But we all knew that when we went there, and we all knew, most of us knew, that it would be very demanding. And but some people went there with the wrong idea of what West Point was. As a matter of fact, there was at the time a primetime television show about West Point, and the show was all about pretty girls and parades and things like that were really gave you a distorted picture of the academy. So we entered in July of 1958, and we entered with 800, and 4 years later we finished with 600. So most of those people washed out in the first 6 months when they came to the realization that what they knew about West Point was not how West Point was. I'd also add, though, that in 1958, I'm 85, and in 1958, the United States was fresh from the military was fresh from its involvement in World War II. The military was in was respected greatly and in high regard. And my generation really was one in which you just did things that had to be done. There was no questioning of authority. If there was someone who was superior to you, you just did them, and you just didn't think twice about it. It was not a hardship. That's the way life was. So for my generation, going through the difficulties of West Point, where A, we expected them, and B, we just knew that if we wanted to succeed, that's what we had to do. We had to persevere.
Did you know when you were in West Point that you wanted to serve a term in something like the Vietnam War? Obviously, you couldn't have predicted that was going to happen, but was it something that you were thinking in your head that if this did come up, I would accept the opportunity to serve in that war?
Well, yes, I did think about that because remember the United States was involved in World War II. So a lot of my instructors, and I entered West Point 13 years after the end of World War II. So a lot of my instructors were veterans of World War II, and then we were involved in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and that had ended 5 years before I entered. So I had a pretty good inkling that the United States and the United States Army would be involved in some future conflict. And so when the war started, my first tour of duty was in Hawaii, which I was very fortunate to get, and it was an idyllic place. We trained hard, but we had a good time. But when the war started, I had an opportunity to volunteer in 1964 to go to Vietnam because as a professional soldier, I felt I needed to understand what war was and what my reaction to a war in which people get hurt might be. So in 1964, I volunteered to go to Vietnam, and that was really the early days of Vietnam. If you'll recall, that's only 10 years after the French left after Dien Bien Phu, and there were only 15,000 Americans there, no ground troops. We were all support people. I was assigned to an aviation unit and led 28 enlisted men to become door gunners on helicopters supporting the Vietnamese army. Now, the interesting thing was the Vietnamese army was really, after the French left, was, except for some specialized units, was really in disarray. And the country was in disarray. So I got to see, when there were very few Americans there, how poor our effort was and how poor their effort was. So at the end of that, I only spent 3 months there. It was a temporary duty assignment. But when I came home, I was greatly discouraged because I went over there with all these high-minded thoughts about how I was going to save democracy for the Vietnamese people, and I saw that they weren't too interested in saving their own democracy, and there was rampant theft of some of the stuff we sent over to try and help them, as well as the Vietnamese army appeared not to be very well led, nor did they appear very interested in prosecuting the war. So I came home and I was very discouraged about war, that war anyhow. But I returned to Hawaii, and then a year later, my entire division, 15,000 soldiers, were sent back to Vietnam as the war began to heat up, and the North Vietnamese introduced more troops, so we introduced more troops. And when I went back the second time, there were 250,000 Americans there instead of 15,000 the first time. And but still, I felt the contrast, and our effort was not worthy of the United States. So I really was discouraged, thinking, well, we weren't winning when we had 15,000. Now we have 250,000. We're still not winning. So yes, I did contemplate that there would be a war, but I thought it might be more like World War II, where I was driving through liberated towns and villages who would be grateful for my effort.
What's it like, someone who's been at war coming back home to reality?
Well, when I went, I had two little girls. I was married and I had two daughters. My second daughter was maybe like 11 days old when I left and a year old when I came home the second time. And so I missed them terribly. I didn't mind the war. I was a well-trained soldier. I knew my job, and I was serving with men that I had trained with for the preceding 3 years. So we had a very cohesive unit. But what you think about, even when things are dull, you think about that things can change rapidly. You know, there's somebody once said that war is hours of boredom interrupted by sheer minutes of terror. And so you're always on edge. When you're in combat, you're always on edge, because it could be calm right now. You could be just sitting laying on your bunk in some place, and mortar rounds could be fired. So after 11 months of that, and I was for most of my time there. The second time I was on a battalion staff. I was on the Cambodian border with my battalion, but I was not leading patrols or doing any of those things. So I never really thought I was going to die. So I never had one of those terror kinds of missions. But nonetheless, it's always prevalent in your mind, especially when you have a family, about how interested you are to see your children and your wife, and to get back. And for me, and I don't know if in Ireland you all know the controversy that still really kind of plagues our involvement in Vietnam, Americans. But there was such there were so many demonstrations about our involvement there, that when the soldiers came home, many of them were vilified and spit on and not welcomed. That was not my case. I came home because I was there early in the war, 1966, when I came home. But those soldiers, my fellow soldiers who came home in 68 or 69 and 70, especially after Tet, and especially after the civilian population turned against our effort there, when Walter Cronkite in 1968 declared that we couldn't win. And the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese especially knew that the way for them to win was to just wait us out, like they had done with the French. They had subverted the French civilian population, and that ultimately led to the deterioration of the military effort. And that was the same thing that happened in the United States. But when I came home, it was early in the war. The country was still supporting it. Unfortunately, 3 or 4 years later down the road, the country turned on all those soldiers, and it was a very unfortunate thing.
How did you feel seeing that villainization come to light? Was it unsettling for you to watch, knowing that you've been at a war before?
Oh yeah, it was very unsettling, because when you go to war, you're risking an awful lot. And the saying is, you're signing a blank check to include your life. And so when you go to war, it's a major, I mean, it's probably the most major commitment you'd ever make in your life. When the civilian authorities and the government that you're supporting does not commit itself to an equal measure of commitment, then it's not fair. It's not fair to send soldiers and give them a half, ask them to risk everything, but have only a half effort and not use all the resources that are available. Like we take World War II, where almost everybody in the United States was committed in one way or another. They were either in uniform or they were working in defense industries, and there was total commitment. Any young man who wasn't in uniform was called to task. Whereas in my war, that wasn't the case. So my resentment is that when you ask people like me, soldiers like me, or other soldiers, to risk their lives, but you don't have a corresponding commitment on behalf of the country, then that's just not fair, and it's not right.
We'll switch now into your book's topic, which is what has been dubbed the game of the century, which is the Army versus Notre Dame in 1946.
Yes.
Give us, as someone who, obviously I'm not involved in American culture, I'm Irish, give the idiot's overview of what this game is before we go into the details.
Sure. Well, the one thing that I don't know if I'm sure you do some writing, but when you write, you have an idea of what the story ought to be. But as you get into it, it kind of takes a life of its own, because you uncover facts and you uncover scenarios that you didn't really know were there, or that were in the background. So as I got into this one, what became interesting to me was the focus on 1946. Now, 1946 in the United States was an interesting kind of culmination of a very tumultuous period that we had here. The Depression started in 1929. And about the time we were coming out of the Depression, when we became the arsenal of democracy and our industry started to get rebuilt, that was in 1939 and 1940. Then we became involved in 1941 in World War II. So we had the country, the United States, had 16 years of really difficulty and hardship and turmoil. First the Depression and then the war, in which most of the population had nothing but grim thoughts. It was just a grinding poverty for most of the country, and then separation from loved ones and fear that loved ones would be killed or wounded or not come home. And so when I focused on the book, I started just focusing on the rivalry, and the rivalry culminated, I'll talk about that in a minute, in 1946. But I really was struck by what that must have been like for the citizens. I was 7 years old in 1946, but of course was not very sensitive to what the culture was at the time. But for the most of the population, it was the first time in 16 years that they could breathe a sigh of relief and enjoy something as simple as a football game without worrying about going home and reading the casualty reports or listening to radio reports of big battles that were overseas. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the rivalry between those two institutions. Now, both of them in the United States, West Point, because it draws its student body from every state in the United States, and our overseas possessions like Puerto Rico, and in those days Hawaii, which was not a state, and as well as foreign countries. We have agreements with a lot of Latin American countries so that they send their students also to West Point. But it had a national following because West Point it gets its students from appointments from each congressman, each senator in the country. So it has a national following. Notre Dame has a national following because it was founded in the mid 19th century. And it was a time when there was kind of a lot of anti-Catholicism. So here was a kind of a bastion of Catholicism in the middle of the country, small school in Indiana, but yet it achieved some greatness that all Irish Americans could be very proud of. And that greatness and the story of that greatness spread across the country, a country that was really a lot was anti-Catholic, and there was not much good publicity for Catholics. So it became a national, had a national following as well. So you had two institutions that were not like the University of Illinois, which appeals to people in Illinois, or Harvard, which appeals to people in Massachusetts, primarily, although they do have somewhat of a more regional following. But so you had those two national institutions. Well, during the war, and we ought to talk about that, the draft age was 18. So we were drafting everyone from age 18 to about age 40 by the end of the war. And so there were no freshmen to go to West Point or any of these other, or to Notre Dame or any of these other schools, because they all were serving. We had a population of 130 million and we had 16 million in uniform. So there were almost no young men available to become college students. And that went across to all universities and colleges, so that they had a lack of students, and they had to they filled it with a Navy program, which the U.S. Navy started in 131 universities who were really hard up to find students, but they put these, they were called V programs, and they put these programs on campuses. Notre Dame had a program where 1,000 naval midshipmen were sent there for a 1-year program every year, which saved Notre Dame financially. So, but at West Point, you had a 3-year program. The normal 4-year program had been shortened to 3 years, and you had a 3-year program where young men could go to learn to be officers and were assured of a 3-year berth at West Point. So West Point had a very stable environment, and all these other schools had a very unstable environment in which these students were passing through at most a year at a time.
At a time where a country is pretty much recovering from a war, why did 74,000 people come together in Yankee Stadium to watch a game of football?
I think because they wanted to believe that normalcy and a bright future and things as mundane as a football game were going to be restored, and that normal life was going to be restored, and that rivalry between Notre Dame and Army went back to 1913. So there were many years from 1913 till 1941 when that rivalry was kind of embedded in the fabric of our sports history, and people followed it, as I said, because of those they had national followings. So people could listen to the radio in Wyoming and root for one of those two teams because they knew someone either that went to West Point or they knew someone at Notre Dame. So in 1946, I think they were grasping to the fact that life was getting back to normal and that tomorrow was going to be better than yesterday.
Amazing. For a game dubbed Game of the Century, why has it got so much praise and so much notoriety behind it when the game ended scoreless?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, as I said, the rivalries stretched from 1913 to really it ended in 1947. But it was, all those games were very close. Notre Dame had won the majority of those games, but they were all close. They were one touchdown or 3 points away. And during the war, and as I said, when all of the freshmen were hard to find, and Notre Dame couldn't keep a football team because most of their students were off at the war. So in 1944, when Army and Navy, our two military academies back then, had really a stable student body, they could field really very strong teams. In addition, they were able to attract young men who thought, well, I want to be an officer, and this is a place for me to go for 3 years. And who knows what'll happen to the war in 3 years. Whereas if you were going to any other school, or if you were 18, you didn't know what was going to happen to you. You were going to either face a draft or you were going to have to enlist in some service. So in 1944 and in 1945, the military academy and the naval academy were extremely strong because they had a stable pool to pull from, and they attracted a lot of strong players. And so in 1944 and 1945, Army beat Notre Dame. Now, remember, Army and Notre Dame were locked in this battle from 1913 on, and hardly any game was decided by more than a touchdown. But in 44 and 45, Army beat Notre Dame by a total score of 105-0 because they were so strong, and Notre Dame was hard pressed to get good players that were free of the war. So in 1946, when the game was to be played, and all of those students, those Notre Dame students who were off at the war, came back and were now going to augment the new recruits that the Notre Dame coach, Frank Leahy, a nice Irish guy, Frank Leahy, had recruited during his wartime service. There was a whole lot of talk and thought about avenging those two embarrassing losses in 44 and 45. So in 46, you had these two giants of football. One was ranked number 1 and one was ranked number 2, playing to decide the national championship. Interesting, West Point, of course, I don't know how much you know about its history, but West Point has been really key to the defense of our country since 1802 when it was founded. I mean, most of the generals in our Civil War were West Point graduates, and in every war thereafter. the key generals, Eisenhower and Patton, and Bradley, and a lot of other key generals were West Point graduates. So when West Point, when the cadets from West Point came down from West Point, which was a short just 60 miles from Yankee Stadium, when they came down on a train and got off the train, they were jeered by the fans as draft dodgers because they had spent the war years at West Point, whereas the Notre Dame guys were all coming. 54 of them had served in the military and were returning home. So it's never again or ever before has anyone accused West Point graduates of being draft dodgers.
Let's talk about some of the players that were in this game. You mentioned Frank Leahy and his impact on it, but there was a lot of other players. There was players like Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside, and in previous matchups with the two teams, there was a group called the Four Horsemen. Can you go into those players and how they fit into this massive achievement in history?
Sure. The two coaches, Frank Leahy, who was a graduate of Notre Dame and who had played at Notre Dame under the great Newt Rockne, who is the idol and the icon of Notre Dame football, became the coach in 1941, just before the war started. And on the Army side, Red Blake, who had played at Army earlier and was great friends with General MacArthur, became the Army coach in 1941. So the rivalry between the schools was enhanced by the rivalry between the two men. Now, the Four Horsemen were players in 1924, much before this game that you and I are talking about, and they were immortalized by a great sports writer, Grantland Rice, who called them the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Because Notre Dame was so strong that year, and they ran through a lot of they were very good players and gave Notre Dame their national championship in 1924 and in the next couple of years. During the 1946 game, though, Army had its best team ever, and the two players who everybody knows here in this country who's an Army fan was Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis. And both of them were Heisman Trophy winners, which is the highest award we give to college football players here in the United States. Both of them were All-American, which is another accolade that newspapers bestow upon the best players. And their quarterback was a guy by the name of Arnold Tucker, who I was fortunate enough to spend a day with when he came to South Bend when I was there. On the Notre Dame side, you had Johnny Lujack, who I also interviewed, who lived close to me in Florida, and I interviewed him. He unfortunately passed away about a year ago when he was 97, I believe. But he was a Notre Dame great, maybe the best, certainly the most well-known of the Notre Dame players. And then there were a couple of people that Frank Leahy in 43 felt that he should go off into the service, so he joined the Navy. And when he joined the Navy, they made him the athletic assistant to the submarine commander in the Pacific, and he had his own plane, and he would fly all around the Pacific. And in the course of inspecting and doing his duty, he also was able to find great players, which he convinced to join him at Notre Dame once the war was over. So there are a couple of those guys that he brought in, and then there were some great freshman players that had not been in the war, that were too young for the war, but that he also brought. Leon Hart, who became an All-American, and some of the others. But so the key names were Lujack and Blanchard and Davis and Arnold Tucker and those two coaches.
You've mentioned there that you got the chance to interview some of the players, and through those interviews, was there anything that you learned about that game or about the importance of that game afterwards that maybe the media didn't pick up on?
Well, I think in this country that game is fading now from memory. But if you get the books and you do the research and you drill down in it, I think there was a pretty good, a matter of fact, a better assessment of its importance back in the late 40s. I think there's a more appreciation for how important that game was than there is today. So when I met those people, I really was I had a great reverence for them and for their achievements. I think today things are so different. Things are so commercialized, and you have TV and you have interviews and you have all kinds of media. So things are just a little bit more expansive and maybe intrusive. But back then, you only had radio. That game had, I think, 150,000 fans who were lucky enough to have a new invention called a television that were able to watch it. But that's 150,000 out of how many? There must have been millions listening to that game. Every radio station in the country had representatives there. So, no, I didn't get any special insights that I already didn't know. As a matter of fact, when I interviewed Johnny Lujack, I knew more about his life than he did because he was 96 when I interviewed him.
I mentioned at the beginning that this game was played in Yankee Stadium, and whenever I wanted to get a feel for what Yankee Stadium really was at that time and things, but in the forum boards and across messenger services, there seems to be a lot of myths kind of about the building process of Yankee Stadium. Did you learn anything about that during your research?
Well, I did learn Yankee Stadium, of course, is an iconic place because it's where, if you follow anyone who understands American baseball, knows of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and then Joe DiMaggio and the players that I followed when I was a young boy, Yogi Berra and players like that. So Yankee Stadium to Americans is really an iconic place. Even when you don't like them, it's an iconic place because that was the place where if your team could go into Yankee Stadium and beat the Yankees, that was quite an achievement. So it's an iconic institution. Interestingly enough, I found out that the Yankees in the late 1918, 1919, 1920 didn't have their own stadium. So they rented room from one of the other teams in New York City, the New York Giants, who played at the Polo Grounds, and they rented space there till they built their own stadium. And then from 1924 until pretty much 1946, that's where every single Army Notre Dame game was played in Yankee Stadium for all those years, except for 1 year when it was played in Chicago for a reason I can't figure out. But so it became associated with the Army Notre Dame rivalry.
Do you think there's still some kind of lasting impact that college football had on American culture because of those games through really tough times?
Yeah, well, there's an interesting comparison today because today I'm going to get into the intricacies a little bit of American college football today, but we just recently, in the last few years, have gone to where we now are allowing college football players to get money for their image and for them to sponsor sponsor products, which was up until a couple of years ago was forbidden. Now all of a sudden you have athletes who are migrating from one college to another because they can get more money if they go to the University of Alabama than they could have gotten if they went to Auburn University, for instance. So there's a lot more mercenary motivation and more driven more by finances than there is by loyalty to a particular university. And so there's all this turmoil as these students are going from school to school, pursuing who can offer them the most money. And that's akin a little bit to what was going on during World War II, when you had these students who were in these V programs. There were three legs to the football programs back during the World War II. There were three legs to it. One was the existing universities who had these V programs where students would be in the school for only a year, and then they were in pre-flight training, and then they would go off to some place to learn how to fly a plane. They do the ground portion at the university for 1 year, and during that time they could play football, and then they went off to become Navy flyers or Marine Corps flyers. And that was one leg. The other leg was the existing schools that could still attract some freshmen and could field a team. And so you had, for instance, at the University of Iowa, you had Iowa Pre-Flight, which was composed of those young student officers who were in the military but playing football. And you had the University of Iowa on the same campus, who was composed of civilians playing football. And those two teams could play on the same campus against each other. And of course, the Iowa Pre-Flight folks were older and were drawn from universities across the country. They had maybe 4 years of playing college at a different university. They were older. Even some professional football players played on those teams. And then the third leg was military bases. Most military bases fielded a team that played against college teams. Interestingly, Great Lakes Naval, which is a big naval base we have near Chicago, which trains enlisted men and naval officers back then during the war, they beat Notre Dame 2 out of 3 years during the war. So this is a naval institution fielded a team that was able to beat Notre Dame during the war. So you had that turmoil during the war, and I see its existence, but for different motives, not nearly the noble motives that there were during the war. I see the motivation of students to go from school to school, not to serve their country, but to serve themselves and to make more money.
How do you feel about the NIL situation, and do you feel like there's maybe a way to change it so it's not breeding as many, I would gonna say superstars, but I'm talking of those few in the top percent that are making crazy professional money, basically?
Yeah. No, I don't have any thoughts on it. I hate it. I mean, I don't like it because there's no loyalty. It used to be somebody would be at Purdue University and they were proud of being at Purdue and wanted to play their heart out for good old Purdue. And now or the Texas A&M, that they were part, and the student body responded to them, and they responded to the student body because their heart was with the blue and the gray or whatever it was. Interestingly, the service academies today there is no NIL at the service academies there, and there's no transferring. You're there, and if you want to play football, you stay there. If you don't want to play football, you leave. But there are all kinds of repercussions. If you leave later on in your career, then you have to go into the military. So the service academies are untouched by this NIL business, but that's going to turn out to be a disadvantage for them.
Yeah, I suppose it's the same situation with the transfer portal. Do you think it's kind of breeding a sense of no loyalty?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's less loyalty than we have in professional sports here. If somebody's on the Chicago Bears, you root for the Chicago Bears, and that guy wants the Chicago Bears to win. But here, it sometimes takes 5 minutes for the announcers to give the pedigree of the guy who spent 1 year here, and then a semester there, and then 2 years here, and it takes a long time to get his pedigree, as opposed to saying, he was a freshman last year, he's coming up now, he's a sophomore. So it's a whole different feel to it. It's taken away the innocence of college football, I think, and and it replaced it with a motivation which I don't think is noble, and that it's easy to look up to, because and these players are kind of emphasizing it as they talk about, well, I signed with these people, but then someone else came to me and offered me more, so now I signed with them, and I've changed my mind. It just is really there seems to be no loyalty at all. So yeah, I think it's ruined college football.
Yeah, I do understand obviously the arguments people have for having things like NIL and the transfer portal because it is the same amount of physical impact as a professional game and concept. But do you think there's an argument where you leave wages and getting paid to whenever you eventually reach the pro game?
Well, what I used to like was American, especially football in our country. That on Friday night you could go to a high school game, and there'd be kids playing their heart out. And on Saturday you could watch a college game where there'd be young people playing their heart out for their alma mater. And then on Sunday you could watch a professional football game. So you could watch football on all 3 days at different levels of performance. But now you kind of run the college game into the professional game. It used to be, in answer to your question, I think it's fair, because it used to be that the great college football players or the better college football players would migrate to the professional ranks and get their reward. But they would have served an equally important function by supporting their school, whichever one they signed up for. So I think there was always a way for them to make money. The top guys. Now I imagine there are some people who can't get to the professional leagues who are now making money that might not otherwise. But I bemoan the loss of innocence, even though it's enriched a lot of those young people.
Well, talk about Notre Dame, because it is one of the most prestigious colleges still today, and it's very rare that people from outside of America hear about Notre Dame. But in Ireland, Notre Dame's been mentioned from as long as I know, and this is something that I need to ask you. From anybody from Ireland that's listening to this will probably have the same question. What is the Irish connection or the Irish attachment to Notre Dame?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it was founded by French priests. So I think the Irish connection goes back, as I said earlier, to maybe the anti-Catholicism and the feeling that Irish people and Catholic people more broadly were maybe subjected to some biases, and in order to kind of deal with that, they grabbed onto a successful Catholic and Irish institution of which they could be proud, and which could stand up and take on and better some of the more established institutions in our country. Early in when football was first started in this country in the late 19th century, the preponderance of really strong teams were in the Northeast. So it was Harvard and Yale and those kind of teams. And then for Notre Dame to kind of make the big time in starting actually with the advent of the Army Notre Dame series. Notre Dame was that first game in 1913 with Army that propelled Notre Dame into the limelight. They beat Army, who had been a powerhouse, and all of a sudden they became nationally very prominent. But I think, in answer to your question, I think when you're a minority and you are underappreciated and maybe vilified in some ways and made fun of in some ways, when you find an institution or you find something that represents your group that's able to handle itself with other groups that are prestigious and have some cultural advantages, when you see your group able to hold its own, I think then you grab onto those that institution and call it your own.
Yeah, it's something I've always wondered because Fighting Irish is the nickname, so I always wondered where it came from. And Notre Dame has recently played a game in Ireland, which is a first, and it was amazing to see. But it was always that a question I had in my head: where did it come from? Because it's not so standoutish, and I thought maybe that had a reason for how popular Notre Dame is in America, and especially in the college world. And you living growing up quite close to Notre Dame, did you see that popularity build over time, or was it just Notre Dame was always a big figure?
Oh, no, I think I don't know if you sense or know, but the pride of Irish Americans is palpable. I mean, we have St. Patty's Day, which is a big deal. Every politician wants to participate in St. Patty's Day, but the Irish contingent, maybe of all the ethnic groups we have in this country, maybe the Irish seem to be the proudest. Uh, when I think about Italian Americans who don't have the same kind of maybe feeling about our heritage. Well, we all are. I'm grateful for my own heritage, but not Irish Americans seem to be the most outspoken and demonstrate their loyalty to their background more than any of the ethnic other. I mean, Germans I don't think do, or I think the Irish have preserved their culture and their history and traditions better than, in my mind, better than the other ethnic groups in this country. So when I was living near Notre Dame, I mean, it was not only the Irish component, but the love for the university. I mean, there's not those people don't just like Notre Dame. They love Notre Dame, and they are rabid in their support. And when Notre Dame has a bad year for one reason or another, it's a major downer, a major it depresses a lot of people, and the natives get very restless until that coach is replaced and Notre Dame reemerges at its what they consider its proper place, which is in the top 5 of universities football teams here in the country. Now, there has always been when as Notre Dame became prominent in football, there was then this push to make sure that it wasn't just football that Notre Dame was known for. Father Hesburgh had a big run-in with Frank Leahy after the war, after World War II, to make sure that Notre Dame football was not the thing that Notre Dame was for. Notre Dame football still is the prominent attribute of Notre Dame, but he reduced the prominence of football and raised the recognition of the academic portion of Notre Dame. So Notre Dame is always trying to keep a balance to make sure that it's just not known as a football factory, but it also is known for its academic achievements and its achievements throughout the world in terms of service to the world. Notre Dame's motto is God, Country, and Notre Dame. And so that's one of the things that I, in my research, found the similarity between Notre Dame's commitment to serving something bigger than themselves and making the world better, which is similar to West Point's Duty, Honor, Country, which implores its students and its graduates to serve the country more than they serve itself. So Notre Dame has always had that kind of tension between the football team and the academic team and its commitment to doing service around the world.
It must be hard for people involved with Notre Dame to balance that when you have players of such talent like Joe Montana and Joe Theismann playing for the football team. What was it like seeing players like that with just complete greatness playing for Notre Dame?
Well, and I always thought that they guys like Joe Montana some of the other great Johnny Lujak, some of the other players. I always thought that they were kind of a cut above, that they were seemed to be untouched by scandal, and they seemed to be just good people. And I think that partly, they were part of a Catholic institution. They lived in there are no sororities or fraternities. They lived in dorms that had priests who were the rectors. So they lived a good Catholic life. I'm sure as a prominent football player, they were able to escape the bounds of that periodically, but they were pretty much good kids who were sensitive to the fact that they represented a Catholic institution, and they didn't want to in any way jeopardize the reputation that institution had. And I've never met a Notre Dame grad, never, and I know a lot of them, who is anything other than grateful that he went there, or proud that he went there, and I've never heard any of them say anything bad about Notre Dame. So they're the guys I've met are pretty much unlike we have some schools where the football players are forever getting arrested or whatever, but Notre Dame, I think, strives and puts guidelines in to make sure that its young men primarily are good representatives of the institution.
I have just one final question for you, and I thought of it at the very start, but I wanted to save it to now because I think this is the perfect way to end. Do you think college football, and maybe just that game in general, saved a real morality plummet after the war in America?
Well, I think it has, but I think it's been more recent than just after the war. I think it was pretty innocent, and now those are the years that I grew up. I was born in 1939, so the year I started following football more closely, college football more closely, 1950 on, and I would say until the Vietnam War in our country. That's when everything changed. Culturally, everything changed in the Vietnam War. It was now chic to demonstrate and to express your displeasure with the government's policies. Whereas up until the Vietnam War, I think we had a pretty cohesive population that was supportive of the military and was supportive of our presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy. But I think the Vietnam War changed us culturally, and probably that impacted what went on in university life, because the universities were the leaders of the protesters during the war. Interestingly enough, not many people know this, but all of those fervent protesters at colleges, they all died down when President Nixon ended the draft. So for someone like me who served, I think it was a little cynical that they were worried about the people of Vietnam until the draft was ended. Then they weren't so much interested. But so in answer to your question, I think culturally it changed during Vietnam and has been, in my mind, on a down slope since. But I'm an old codger. I'm an old guy, so that's what old people think. Old people think that the good old days were the good old days.
Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure, and the amount of knowledge that you have stored about these times it's absolutely incredible. And some of the things that I've learned along the way, I've been taking notes to add the show notes and stuff, and I'm running out of space in my notebook to write them down. There's just so many gems. So thank you very much for coming and talking about that game.
Well, thank you. I hope the people in Ireland are, or the ones that listen to your podcast, get a greater appreciation for the many facets of America. It's more than just Taylor Swift and some of the other things that maybe are more well known over in Europe.
I'm sure it will.
So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem at all. Thank you, Richard. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.